Hello, everyone. My name is Kathleen Johnson, and I am your host of the Kreactivators podcast. With me today is Teal Phelps Bondaroff. So, if you were with us, you know that we recorded part one, and now we're bringing you part two. So, in this episode, Teal is going to elaborate a little bit more about his work with BC Humanists and some of the work they've been doing around separation of church and state and what that is shaping up to look like in Canada. So, Teal, just a little quick introduction about yourself, just for people that may not have seen the first episode, and then we'll get into what we're here to talk about.
Well, thanks for having me back on. I'm glad I could get invited back. I'm Dr. Teal Phelps Bondaroff. I wear a lot of hats. I'm a counselor in the district of Saanich in the local government. I am the chair and co-founder of Access BC, the topic of our last conversation, where we do work on reproductive justice. I'm also the research director of research for Oceans Asia. I work in marine conservation, mostly combating marine wildlife crime. I help build and support Little Free Libraries. My background's in international politics. I study the political strategy of non-state actors, specifically groups that are doing cool stuff on the high seas, cool and interesting stuff. But today we're talking about my other final hat, which is my role as research coordinator for the BC Humanist Association. And I've been doing that for, many years now, getting close to a decade, I think. And in that capacity, I help coordinate and do a lot of the research for the BC Humanist Association, which is an organization supporting humanism and as a home for atheists, agnostics, humanists, and non-religious people in British Columbia. And we're a organization that punches well above our weight. We've got a small research team, but small but mighty, and we churn out a lot of research looking at the separation of religion and government, state neutrality. We cover a wide range of topics, and I'm really glad most of our research team are volunteers, and we do a lot of, I think, important work on this issue that is increasingly becoming more and more important in Canada.
Amazing. So, just to let folks in a little bit on what this issue was about, because a lot of people might not have any clue as to what your work is based on in this regard. Can you talk about the Saguenay decision and what that means for prayer in before meetings and especially in government situations? Um, what does that kind of look like, and what are the implications it has for the rest of the country?
Yeah, there's a lot of backstory here. So I'll tell my journey as to how I became the research coordinator of the BC Humanists, and I'll couch it within the Supreme Court ruling around state neutrality in Canada. When I moved back from grad school in the UK, came back to British Columbia, or came to British Columbia rather. I always fell in love with British Columbia. I had to come back to Canada as part of my research funding, and of course I wanted to. And I set up shop here in on Vancouver Island in Saanich. And one of the things that I did as a huge political nerd was, of course, go to question period in the Legislative Assembly as soon as I could. And one of the things that really shocked me was daily sessions of the BC legislature opened with a prayer. And I look back through a few of the prayers. Some of them were quite religious. Some of them were very religious. Some of them were strange poetry or weird commentary. And I reached out to every humanist, atheist, and secular group in North America with a research project I wanted to do, which was to study the prayers in the BC legislature. And the only group that got back to me was the BC Humanists. And I've been doing work with them ever since, and eventually kind of created my job as the research coordinator. And that project was looking at prayers at open legislative assemblies. But the Saguenay project, which we've now worked on, is looking at prayer in municipal council meetings. And there's a bit of backstory here, and it's worth going into. But effectively, legislative assemblies across Canada, we have a report on this as well if folks are interested. But legislative assemblies across Canada some of them open with prayer. That's a fixed prayer that's written. Some of them open with the Lord's Prayer, which is obviously an overtly Christian prayer. Some provinces and territories open with nothing, and some of them open with uh, elected officials' choice. And as a result, and British Columbia is one of those, as a result, you have politicians doing prayer. And sometimes they're okay. Sometimes we had a thank God for shipping contracts once, which is a bit weird. There was one MLA that used their opportunity of delivering a prayer to threaten a union, which was, I think, probably deeply inappropriate. And that's been an interesting element. So the conversation about whether you can have prayer in the legislature is still an open debate. There's questions about parliamentary privilege and those kinds of things. When it comes to municipalities in Canada, you cannot open a municipal council meeting with prayer. And the background goes back to 2006. Alain Simoneau, who was a resident in Saguenay in Quebec, was attending his council meetings regularly, noticed that they opened with an overtly Christian prayer led by the mayor, where all the members of council would then cross themselves. He objected to this because obviously it created a space where Christianity and specific sects of Christianity were privileged over others. And the municipality did not adjust their procedures. It worked its way through various courts and eventually ended up at the Supreme Court of Canada, which in 2015 ruled in the Saguenay decision that the state in Canada has a duty of religious neutrality. It defined religious neutrality as abstention. So true neutrality is not taking a position either way on an issue, and as a result, you can't have prayer in a municipal council meeting. I should also add that the Supreme Court ruled that this was a democratic imperative. This is not a nice to have, this is a must have. You cannot open a meeting with prayer because it necessarily excludes some people as opposed to other people. When you open a meeting with, say, an overtly Christian prayer, not only are you excluding people from other faith traditions, but you're also excluding people from different sects of Christianity, but also you're excluding non-religious people. Now, I'm a city councillor in the district of Saanich, so I attend all of our meetings Monday nights, sometimes Tuesday public hearings. And those meetings, we always have members of the public who are presenting to council. Folks are allowed to speak for 3 minutes or 5 minutes on various topics. And we want to hear from the public. Those public interventions are really important to letting us know if what we're doing is consistent with what the community wants. And we get great feedback from our members of the community. But of course, we want to make sure that everyone is welcome in that space. So when you open a municipal council meeting with an overt prayer from one faith tradition, you're basically saying that people of other faith traditions are guests in that space. They're much less welcome. Now, people, when they come to the microphone, they're being live streamed. There's a whole crowd of people behind them. It might be their only time speaking in public. And I know a lot of people find that very intimidating. I'm an old debate coach, and I think people would say that one of the largest fears, one of the most common fears for people is public speaking. So there's enough factors making it hard for someone to share their views with local government, let alone having a structural barrier suggesting that they're less welcome because of their faith or lack thereof. And what was really interesting and what got me really involved in launching the Saguenay project many years ago was I was attending the inaugural or watching the inaugural meeting of my council, Saanich, in 2018, and they included 2 prayers. And I knew for a fact from our previous research looking at legislative assemblies across Canada that you can't have any prayer in a municipal council. So we launched the Saguenay project, and we started by looking at all the municipal councils in British Columbia. We looked at their inaugural and their regular council meetings. For those who are listening, an inaugural meeting is a meeting that takes place after an election when new councillors are sworn in. There's often an address by the mayor. There's bagpipes, there's pomp, there's circumstance, town criers in some contexts. And in those situations, also sometimes prayer. And so we did a survey of all the municipalities across British Columbia, and we put out our first report several years ago. Got my notes, checks notes here. But our first report, when we were looking at it, we found a lot of municipalities had included prayer in those meetings. Specifically, 27 municipalities had prayer in their inaugural meetings in 2018, and none had prayers in their regular council meetings. And we launched our first report. And since then, we've been monitoring the situation such that every election, every municipal election in British Columbia, we do another report. And between those reports, we've done a lot of advocacy. And I'm really pleased to say that in 2022, only 7 or 4.7% of municipalities had prayer in their inaugural meetings following the 2022 municipal elections. We've done a lot more advocacy since then, and the last 7 municipalities have all admitted that they will no longer do the practice or have told us they won't do the practice next time, including our holdout municipalities of Parksville and Vancouver. That Vancouver had 5 prayers in their 2022 inaugural meeting. Those 2 both required some lawyer letters. But once they received letters from our lawyers and their lawyers read them and realized that the Supreme Court was very clear on the Saguenay issue and very clear that you can't open a meeting with prayer, they very quickly changed those, or said they would change those practices. What will we be doing in British Columbia after the 2026 elections this October is another review to make sure that everyone's working where they should be and is consistent with the Constitution. But we've also done reports on PEI and Manitoba, Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and a report we put out last week on New Brunswick. And our project, the Saguenay project, has now published 9 reports, and we're working our way across the country looking at most of the provinces and just making sure that municipalities don't have prayer. We find one that opens their meeting with prayer, they get a letter from us. If they don't discontinue the practice, they get a more firm letter. And then later on down the line, lawyers get involved at some point. And that's been one of our, I think, more successful projects. We were able to declare British Columbia prayer free in 2023. And we're going to keep working on that until we've ended unconstitutional prayer across Canada.
Wow, that is quite the process. And I know you've been going province to province, and just for folks that might be like, what's wrong? What's wrong with a little opening the meeting with a little bit of with a little bit of prayer and not seeing it as exclusionary? And also what your take is on, what's the harm?
Yeah, no,
I think that's like a big misconception can be, it's just a way to open the session for everybody in a good way and is not really harmful. So I know you mentioned a couple things, but just if you wanted to speak to that a little bit more, because I know that's a common comment that you
yeah,
get.
absolutely. And just on process, I forgot to mention the process that we follow is we look at the agendas, the minutes, and the videos of all those meetings. So we're trying to cross reference our information. And when we find prayer, we then transcribe it and include that in our reports. And folks can find all these reports on the BC Humanist Association website. They're long. I'm a long winded guy. So I think our last report was like 76 pages. Our Ontario report weighed in well over 110 pages. Um, and there's lots to say on this. It's conversation of philosophy and law and data, and there's a rich gazpacho of information there. But your question was sort of what's the harm, and that's a really good one. A lot of people ask this. Now, opening a meeting with prayer is ultimately symbolic, but it does really create a tone where some people are being excluded or some people are being more welcome than others. And that's a real challenge. And the question you asked was a really good one, which is like, how do people understand what the harm is? And here I often use an illustration that was actually coming directly from the Supreme Court ruling. Because one of the things the Supreme Court ruled in Saguenay was trying to understand, like, what is the problem with removing prayer? And if we remove prayer, are we necessarily then discriminating against religious people? And you and I probably know that old hackneyed expression of removing a privilege only seems like discrimination to those who are privileged, right? Um, and so that's very much often the case. But the illustrative example that the Supreme Court used was the opposite of prayer is not no prayer. The opposite of prayer would be opening a meeting with the declaration that there was no God. And so, for people who are wondering how this excludes people, the thought experiment I suggest they do is imagine you show up to a municipal council meeting where the opening statement is a statement that overtly declares that your God and your religion are wrong. How would that make you feel? Would that make you feel welcome in that space? Or would that make you feel perhaps like a second class citizen when you're going to your local government? And I find that often helps. It's the kind of some of the work that the Satanists are doing in the United States or the Church of Satan, they're doing in the United States, where they can really show people their biases and their privilege by simply saying, okay, well, if we can open a meeting with a prayer, let's open it with the declaration that your God doesn't exist. And if someone feels uncomfortable by that, and they probably should, and I wouldn't blame them for feeling that way, then you have right there the ready made argument as to, well, let's not have this practice. And of course, it is symbolic, but there's knock on effects of having this kind of privilege of one view over another. As a local councillor, I see this very often in, say, things like our tax policy. So, a lot of municipalities offer permissive tax exemptions to different recipients. Permissive tax exemptions are a way of waiving municipal taxes to groups that are providing a benefit to the community. And what's really interesting is when you look at how permissive tax exemptions are set up in a lot of municipalities, they'll often automatically grant those exemptions to places of worship without any kinds of benefits testing. Make sure that the group is actually providing a good to the community, not just to their members. Whereas a community group like the Brownies or the Scouts or a local rowing club or a heritage society, they have to jump through hoops to demonstrate that they're providing a good to the community. But another recipient, it's automatically assumed. And that is an example that deals with millions of dollars in in taxpayer money, and how it's allocated. And there's a lot of other aspects to this as well. And so I think that's something that folks should bear in mind, that we're not just talking about a symbolic act of opening a meeting, although that is of course important, but it's also all the policies that flow from that kind of privilege that can have an impact on people, their tax dollars, and whether a community is welcoming to all people, regardless of their faith or none.
Hey, awesome. Thanks for explaining that. And I mean, not to say we can't change people's minds, but at least that somebody has full context now as to why it might be problematic. And so we know that the city of Saguenay is in Quebec, and Quebec has had its perception that it's also racist, that these kinds of laws banning hijabs and other outward expressions of religious affiliation is often interpreted as also tied to racial issues, and tensions build up in regards to that. Um, how do we address religion and the state being neutral while also maintaining people's cultures and their racial identity and all those things that kind of it's intertwined? How do you message that?
And that is such a good question. We actually had a report that we put out last month on La Cité, which is the Quebec version of secularism, and I'd encourage people to check that report out. It basically goes argument by argument on a new report in Quebec about La Cité. And one of the things that is really fascinating is the way that secularism is framed in Quebec is different than the rest of the country. And it's this difference between open versus closed secularism, or hard versus soft secularism, depending on someone's preference. And the difference there would be a lot of the work that the BC Humanists do is open secularism. We want a society where people are able to express themselves and be free in that way. And we often find ourselves walking arm in arm with religious minorities who themselves are oppressed. When a meeting opens with prayer, it's not just the non-religious who are feeling excluded. It's the people from other faith traditions, the Muslims, the Jews, the Sikhs, the Jainists, the Scientologists, the Ekankarists. All those different folks are also themselves excluded from the process. And so we often find ourselves working with religious minorities or non-majoritarian faith traditions to fight for religious freedoms, because that's a lot of what we're talking about is. Um, the closed secularism in Quebec is a different conversation, where, as you were mentioning, there's this hint of not just a hint, of sometimes overt discrimination, telling people how to dress, telling them they can't dress a certain way, or if they need to dress a certain way based on their faith, then they're going to get kicked out of their job or something along those lines. And that's something that we've always opposed, because people should have the ability to express themselves and express their religions. But I think the live debate we're seeing in Quebec right now is around that difference in closed versus open secularism. And I very much encourage people to check out our report on that, because it was really fascinating going through this provincial report and going point by point, where one of the recommendations is they want to make it harder to restrict people's religious freedoms. We like that. That's good. There should be a higher barrier. That makes sense. But then the next sentence, or the next clause, is restricting the access to prayer rooms at universities. And you're thinking, well, people who are religious need space to pray. Why can't we have a prayer room? That's problematic. And so we kind of went back and we go back and forth on each issue and explain our rationale as to whether it's a good policy or a bad policy. And a lot of that stems from this difference between open and closed secularism. So you're very right. Like, a lot of that closed secularism is racism, right? Oh, you can't wear a headscarf, but you're allowed to wear a cross necklace. Come on, like, what are we doing here, people? That's just discrimination. As opposed to this idea that opening a meeting with one religion being moved forward and put to the foreground versus another being ignored. I should note, when we're talking about Saguenay, we're specifically talking about the state allocating time during a meeting for prayer. So if a member of a city council is religious and has religious paraphernalia or clothing or whatnot, that's totally great. That's perfect. That's fine. And not only that, but if a member of council wants to evoke their own religious beliefs when talking about council decisions, they're more than welcome to. So, if I'm approving a housing development on 5th and Main, and I believe that my deity inspired me to support 6 stories of density in that community, and I want to tell council that, I'm more than welcome to. That's not a problem. The issue would be when you have set time at a meeting for prayer, because then you're literally saying we're privileging religion over non-religion and one religion over other religions, as opposed to letting individual members of council express themselves. So there's a bit of nuance there, which is always really important to note. The difference between when someone's acting in a professional, not professional, when someone's acting in a capacity as a representative of the state, they need to be then neutral. But when someone's acting on their own behalf, sharing their own personal views on things, they're obviously welcome and they should be encouraged to express their views however they like. So there's a little bit of nuance there, which is always really important. But I think your point was really strong. People often can, and we're seeing sometimes people using these secularism arguments to promote discrimination in places like Quebec and other places as well. And we're starting to see other groups try to hijack that. One of the examples I wanted to pivot towards, and sorry to jump in this one, was we've literally seen this neutrality language represented in Bill C-25 sorry, not C, Bill 25 in Alberta, where they're trying to create neutral classrooms. But their definition of neutral classrooms is that you can't have pride flags, you can't have, every child matters signs, and we're not going to teach about, gender differences or gender spectrums or different people's sexual identities and things like that. And so they're kind of using neutrality as a weapon against progress and inclusion. And I find that, well, deeply worrying, but also part of this very live debate. And it's kind of like how we saw the anti-vaxxers during the pandemic using the "my body, my choice" rhetoric from feminist circles to try to advocate for their their position. And I find that kind of this interesting situation when one movement sort of absorbs the rhetoric of another movement trying to achieve their almost often opposite views. So that was a bit of a pivot there. We went from Quebec to Alberta to anti-vax content, but maybe bring us home, please. Bring me home at least.
No, I mean, I think that is something that the right is expert at, is co-opting the language of the left and then weaponizing it back at them, back at us. 'Cause we're on we're on the left, we're lefties. Um, and, I think, yes, a lot of people might not understand the reasons, and you just laid out why. That it's advantageous for everybody. It's more inclusive. If you have no prayer before you start a meeting, in houses where it's the people's house, the council is supposed to represent population, and so we want to make sure these spaces are healthily neutral, not toxically neutral. Um, and so, just in wrapping this up, I just wanted to get your thoughts on this is a kind of difficult one, but explaining what humanism is. And I think I really wanted to. Maybe we even should have started with this, but I think a lot of people um, don't understand. So when people ask me what are my beliefs? If I've deconstructed from Christianity, then what do I believe? And so I talk about being a humanist, but I say, I'm an atheist secular humanist. Go digest that. Um, so can you kind of frame that for folks? Because I think fundamentally, a lot of people don't understand what that is. I've had friends say, beware of, they kind of link it to Satanism and think it's something like that. So I think there's all kinds of weird and wonderful things that are in the ether when you talk about humanism or atheism or these kinds of identifications. So just some general framing, if you will, for folks about what that really means. Like maybe even what that means for yourself as an individual. But what is humanism, and what um, I mean is it's not a religion, but a lot of people think it's because they think in religious terms. They think, okay, so you have to believe in something. So what is the belief
Yeah.
of humanism?
Well, it's a great question. Actually, I just finished working on a very large report on humanist chaplains, which now I'm just going to throw that into the conversation to make it even more confusing because people think of chaplains and chaplaincy as a religious vocation, and they haven't thought of humanist chaplains. But around the world, we have a bunch of humanist chaplains. So I'll come back to that. But I wanted to just frame that I've been having this live conversation in a big, like 170-page report I was just churning out on humanist prison chaplains, in fact. And no, it's a really good question. And the best summary of humanism I've heard is good without God. It's, personal life stance where people can come up with their own ethical system based on not religion. But often it's described as sort of a life stance that is foregrounds human reason and scientific inquiry and compassion and trying to solve our problems through human efforts rather than relying on the supernatural or religious dogma. So it's the idea that we're here alone. We as humans should prioritize human well-being and human flourishing and progressing as a society and moving towards things that benefit people and using science and reason to govern that process rather than dogma and the supernatural and those kinds of things. I do want to just pick up on you were mentioning Satanism, and I always find that interesting. I mentioned this in my commentary before. There are different groups of Satanism, and one of them is the Satanist Temple, which is actually a group that does a lot of humanist advocacy and around separation of religion and government, because they use that perception of Satanism being the opposite of, say, Christianity, um, and they'll use that to kind of foreground the religious freedom tensions that emerge in the states. Like, hey, oh, you want to have religious freedom, but you only want to have religious freedom for a very narrow band of religions. And suddenly, when you've got flying spaghetti noodle monsters and the Church of Satan folks, or the Satanist Temple folks, sorry, out there in the public square saying, great, you can put up the Ten Commandments all you want. We have a Baphomet statue. Have you not seen it? It does really challenge those perceptions. And I think that's really important to note, that there's different groups that are out there that have different views. But yeah, that's kind of the take on humanism. It's really a philosophy and a life stance. And then me personally, humanism is a part of my personal views. But I'm a progressive. I'm a social democrat. I work in ecology, and I could start adding labels and adding layers to all those things. I think as humans, we believe in lots of different things, and often when we are given the free ability to inquire, and that free inquiry allows us to explore a wide range of philosophy. Most of the books behind me, most of these ones are on my work on environmental politics. We've got a lot of humanism over here. We've got feminism down behind my back, and all these different things are part of my own identity. But humanism, one thing people will find is humanists are often involved in progressive issues because we believe in the flourishing of people. And that often means putting people first. And if you put people first, that means fighting for increasing access to healthcare, fighting for increasing access to housing and food and those kinds of things. When the idea, I think a lot of times when suffering is written off as something that's prescribed from on high, there may be a disincentive to address that suffering. But when suffering is something that we as humans can fix today in the world around us in a tangible way, we're more highly motivated to actually address that suffering. And so you see humanists at the front of these things. One of the things I love to point out to people is one of the founders of Humanist Canada and the BC Humanist Association, sort of by extension, was Morgenthaler, who fought for increasing access to abortion rights in Canada. And as we've heard from the previous episode, I myself am heavily involved in reproductive justice work, as well as my work with BC Humanists and other causes. So humanism, I think, is one of those things that grounds us in we can make the world better. We don't need to wait for the supernatural to fix it for us. And rather than praying, maybe we should just roll up our sleeves and get to work and make the world a better place.
Yeah, my background religiously is interesting, because it involves loose Anglicanism growing up, and staunch evangelicalism, and then I was Mormon for 13 years. So I've kind of run the gamut in terms of religious beliefs. But I think you're right. This kind of grounds me in a way that I understand this is my one shot. Um, I'm not looking for forgiveness after I cross over into another realm. I am focused on making this experience that I have in this life the most rich experience that I can, and everybody leaving me better. I really don't want to make anybody's life difficult. I certainly don't want to harm anybody, and or our planet or what have you. And so I think a lot of the times these kinds of beliefs can kind of clash with people's sensibilities because um we're taught that, like you mentioned, that a deity that can fix things for you, so to speak. And then some people will argue, well, um, you're being used as a vessel by that deity to do the good work that you are doing. Um, so there's all these kinds of little things that come up. And I think that's why it's such an interesting back and forth debate when it is actual, genuine um, debate. And it's
Mhm.
not a lot of the things that we've been seeing in the public square where it's let me just line people up and knock them down kind of thing. And it's not really a genuine debate and back and forth. And I know you have a lot of experience debating. Um, and so one of the tenements of I was about to say this lifestyle, but that sounds weird. One one of the tenements of humanism is critical thought, and it is that kind of intellectual exercise and exploration. Um, and you are also a short form creator. You create a lot of you know, you create a lot of content where people can learn in 2 seconds or 3 seconds about an issue. And so that doesn't leave a lot of room for nuance and critical thinking and debate. So, just in closing here, going forward, when we know this landscape is changing of how we interact with each other, how we talk about these issues, and what's important to us and what we believe, what are some of your thoughts on what that looks like for this space where we are interacting a lot online and there's not a lot of room for critical thought and debate and all of these things?
That is such a good question. It's really interesting. I'm coming up on my 3,000th video for the Access BC contraception campaign, and I do find myself repeating myself many, many times in those videos to the point where I think I can do my spiel in about 47 seconds at high speed to the point where your listeners would have to turn down the speed. And but it is interesting because that short form content, my videos, I often I have to go for 3 minutes or even longer. And folks who are listening here can see I have got lots to say. And there's a reason why most of our reports are very lengthy. And I very much like pairing the short form with a longer documentation that supports it. I'm an academic at heart. And so when I say something like free contraception improves health outcomes and saves governments money, there are pages of research and supporting documentation and citations available on my website. And so the stuff we're talking about today with the Saguenay decision, I gave you a very short summary of Saguenay, and I usually do when I'm doing a short video, but that's a 100 and something odd paragraph long court decision with many pages and sidebar conversations and deep dives and citations. And so I think we can't forget that this short interaction should be a stepping off point for learning rather than a terminus. I love listening to educational content on TikTok, but I also know that that 3-minute video probably doesn't cover all the nuance that's in that issue. And so I think we need to always approach these things critically and say, hey, I just learned about the history of the gladius, or there was a scandal going around on some TikTok circles about whether or not if you relocate a spider from indoors to outdoors, the spider will die because it's an indoor spider or not. I'm not an entomologist, so I can't weigh in on that debate, but there's a very live debate being done right now. And I think it's really important that we keep our critical faculties open, particularly in this world when anyone can be a creator. You see videos online and you're thinking, oh, this person seems credible. Like when I'm talking about sea cucumbers or reproductive health or local issues, I know what I'm talking about. But if you see me making a video about how to design a very good bridge or how to repair an engine, then we're going to get into trouble, and that's not going to be very good. So I think the short form content is great as a starting point. And those debates are also really important too, because I think with sort of attention economy, you want to kind of challenge people's preconceptions sometimes and have them really think, and then ideally go away and reflect and maybe change their views, but they're not going to change their view right away. So when I'm interacting with a troll who's in our comments, or even an earnest person who's asking questions, perhaps, or challenging us on certain issues, I'm always kind of aware of the fact that there's an audience, and that audience is probably the people who are most likely to be receptive of the message rather than the person you're talking to. And we need to keep that message one, be aware that the audience is watching. It's not just a one-on-one. There's a crowd of people who are watching what we're doing, and we need to be trying to engage with their values and their perspectives and make sure that they're part of it, part of the conversation. A couple of things you're mentioning too was just on humanism. I wanted to just jump in on as well, which was I find there's something really interesting about sometimes the views that people have they don't reflect on them very deeply. You were talking about like vicarious redemption and forgiveness, and I always find that one really challenging because if you hurt someone, you want to apologize to that person, you want to give redress to that person. If I crash into your car, I should be compensating you to repair your car, and you my bike, or vice versa. And in that situation, asking, saying, oh, no, I'm not going to pay the insurance for your car or fix the repairs, someone else will do it, seems to me quite deeply problematic. I think the stronger stance is to say we're going to work together to make things better. And also the other thing too is a lot of times people rob themselves of their own agency. Well, they'll say, oh no, like you were talking about being a vessel used by a deity to achieve good. But often it's someone who is turned their life around. They're trying to get off drugs or alcohol, or to fix a challenge in their life, and they do it themselves. They do an amazing job, and then they give the credit to a deity, and you're like, no, you did this. You did an amazing thing. You're sober. It's amazing. Don't give the credit to a deity. Take it yourself, and have that ownership. But yeah, I think the short form world is also really good, I think, in some ways. I watch a lot of TikTok debates where people will call in, there'll be a quick back and forth. And I think those also create a really great space for discourse. The challenge, of course, is making sure that discourse is constructive and engaging. And too often it doesn't become that way. And there's more trolling and uh, bad interest actors. But at the same time, there can be a really great space for debate, for people to learn about argumentation and rhetoric and values, and the issues that are being discussed. So that's a long answer to, I think, these platforms have a lot of value, and those short form conversations have a lot of value, but you can't treat them as a terminus. They had to be very much an opening of other opportunities for learning, and that's critical.
Yeah, I think we were just having this discussion before this started about the experience that people will remember beyond that quick snippet. And, how are we engaging people over a period of time or in between our videos? I create content, you create content, but how are we actually building community so that, there's always that opportunity to go back and have these debates and discussions and dive in webinars. Like there's so many different ways where we can tease out these things and really help educate people. So I just really appreciate what you do, what BC Humanist does. I know any of the interactions and any of the things I've presented to you all have been a wonderful experience. And our meeting at Humanist Canada is an organization that I was on the board of for a couple years, and I know we first met there. So your work is very extensive, and it's helped a lot of people. And so I just being a friend and a colleague, I really want to thank you for the work that you do. And where can people find you? Where do you hang out the most online?
Thanks so much. And I just before I share that and plug, I wanted to say I think the point you made just now was perfect, was community. A lot of times we often feel like we're talking to our phone and we're just kind of screaming into the void. But there is a community out there. And I've often said this, but the solution to our problem isn't community, but the way that we're going to solve our problems is through community. And so we collectively can get together and solve problems, and you need that community space. And often there's a great book for folks on tyranny, Snyder's on Tyranny. And if people are looking for something short to read that can give them hope in a time when we see a rise of fascism and far right Christian nationalism in the States and here in Canada, that book's got a lot of great tips. And one of them, which I love, and this is maybe some homework for folks who are listening, is The Power of Small Talk. You're in line for the groceries, and rather than having your head down, you talk to the people next to you and just create that human interaction. Because so much of the forces of that are causing harm in our civilization and society these days is trying to divide people and keep them apart. So when you're on the bus, rather than not talking to anyone, meet new people. When you're at a little free library or you're at the grocery store, meeting those new people and those creating those human connections is the foundation of community. And it's so critical to addressing the problems that face our world today, because we are in a poly crisis. There's so many different challenges that we face, whether it's cost of living or housing or the environment or the rise of Christian nationalism. These are all huge problems, and we can solve them together, but it starts with community. And if folks are interested in getting more engaged with my community, my website's teale.ca, teale.ca, and you can find information about all my different projects there. There's a newsletter I put out every month with updates. There's a lot of Saanich stuff in there, so if you're not a Saanich resident, you can skim through that. But there's updates on my work on little libraries and reproductive justice, and work on the BC Humanists, and work on getting more doctors to my community, and a bunch of other projects that I'm involved in. And other than that, the BC Humanist Association, we of course have our website. Folks can find that at bchumanist.ca. And there's a whole bunch of information there about the Saguenay project, some very lengthy reports on a wide range of topics that folks can take a deep dive into. And I think that's I think a good spot to stop, which is, as you're going through these issues and you see these snippets of information, know that there's often lots of research underpinning those. And last thing I'll say, actually, I should say, is the BC Humanist Association research team is always looking for volunteers. And we have a really great way of engaging with the community, I think, which is through citizen science. So I'm an academic. I'm trained to do academic research, and we have some people who volunteer in our projects who are similarly trained. But we also engage with people from all walks of life. Whether it's transcribing some of the content for the prayers that we're talking about, whether it's finding the data, whether it's helping us with designs or graphics or communication, there's a role for everyone in a movement. And I think that's a really important thing to leave off, which is you can make the world a better place, find out something that you love, and then use that thing that you love doing to make the world a better place. For me, that's research advocacy. For you, if it's music, then go use your music to make the world better and engage people. And a revolution without dancing is not a revolution worth having. So we need our troubadours on the sidelines, and not sidelines at the front lines, quite frankly. And so find your passion and know that you can use that passion to help in the movement to make the world a better place. And I think that's a really important message, because often people, they think someone else is going to do it. But as we said with humanism, we're here. We have to solve the problems ourselves, and we solve it together. And we need everyone on board, whether they're musicians, whether they're researchers, whether they're builders, whether they're nurses. All those people we need on board, and we can do it together, hopefully.
Well, thank you so much. A big part of my message in what I do with diversity, equity, and inclusion is democratizing it, because I
Mm.
think it's a lot of it has lived in academia, and people think they have to be experts to engage, and you definitely do not. So these kinds of efforts where folks can feel a part of it, no matter where they're coming from, are so important. So thank you so much, and we'll have all of Teal's information in the show notes. You'll know exactly where to find him and keep up with him. I am fortunate because I get the Christmas newsletter, so I'm on the mailing list for that. I'm very privileged. But if you're not, you can reach out to Teal, maybe DM him. I don't know what you really have a question for him. Uh, he's very well informed, and that's what we want to do. We want to stop the flow of misinformation and disinformation and have the most credible experts on that we can. And so, thank you, Teal. And that'll be all for today. You can find Teal on TikTok. We'll have, as I said, his information for his short form content. And if you're interested in those research papers or anything else long form, and you really want to get into it, we'll also include some of those links for you as well, and have as much information for you as we can in the show notes on this wonderful individual that I'm privileged to know. Thank you, Teal.
Thanks for having me on. Thanks for the work that you do as well. It's so important. And I'm glad I could have a great conversation with you today.
Thank you.